I'm going to go ahead and introduce our featured speaker, Jim Perloff. It's a real honor, Jim. Thanks for coming out.
You didn't leave you with a lot to say.
Now, one thing is that I'm going to be sitting down during tonight's talk, and I'm going to explain why that is. Usually I'm kind of running around with a mobile mic and I'm really animated. And the reason I'm not doing that tonight is that after signing up to do this talk, I was diagnosed with cancer. You can actually see it bulging out my neck right here. And one of the effects it has is that it just drains my stamina. So I will be sitting down. But fortunately, I have a lot of pictures for you to look at. I'm not that attractive to look at even without the cancer. One nice thing about all this is that I don't have to wear a tie tonight because I can't fit my shirt collar around this thing. I'll just mention incidentally, by the way, I'm almost done with a full medical workup on this. At the same time, I'm trying every naturopathic approach I can to this. If I can heal it through prayer support and through natural methods, that's what I prefer to do.
We need you, Jim.
Oh, thanks. Question, does the man up there agree with that? But I want to leave myself aside now because there are more important things going on in this country. So let's start right in. We're going to be talking about American history in a way that some of you may never have heard it told tonight. And we're going to start with the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, December the 7th, 1941. Left about 2,000 Americans dead. 18 warships, including 8 battleships, were sunk or heavily damaged, and about 200 planes destroyed on the ground. Now, what do you think the big question was on Americans' minds the day after Pearl Harbor? Besides, what are we going to do to the Japanese about this? What do you think everyone was asking?
Did America perhaps know that this was going to occur?
If you were really smart, you would have asked that. But what most people were saying, well, the typical question of the day was, how could this have happened to America? How could such a disaster have taken place? Why were we caught off guard? So President Roosevelt appointed a commission to answer that question. It was called the Roberts Commission, and it could be called a very Washington-friendly group. Now, the man in the middle, Supreme Court Justice Owen Roberts, who ran it, was a close friend of the president, and retired Admiral Joseph Reeves had been given a job in Lend-Lease by President Roosevelt, and the 2 Army generals who served on it, one was the close personal friend of the Army Chief of Staff, George Marshall, and the other was on his personal staff and chosen on his recommendation. Now, the commission held about 3 weeks of hearings, a couple days in Washington and the rest in Hawaii, and then they published a report, and their findings were that Washington had discharged its duties in an exemplary manner, and all the blame lay in our Hawaiian commanders, namely Admiral Husband Kimmel, the Pacific Fleet commander, and General Walter C. Short, the Army commander in Pearl Harbor. So these men had not taken adequate surveillance measures of the waters surrounding the islands, and said they were guilty of dereliction of duty. All across America, the words dereliction of duty appeared on headlines. Americans said they should be shot. In fact, members of Congress said they should be shot. They received death threats and hate mail. Well, Kimmel and Short,
Sorry, you're buzzing
too
a little
much?
bit. You can just space it a little.
Oh, good.
Another
I was
issue.
afraid to be too little.
Want to make sure we
How
get
is this
good
right now?
Good.
Are we doing good right now?
Not as good.
No. How about right now?
But just towards the mic, but not right up in it.
How are we doing right now?
Good.
Better. Okay, all right, thank you. Always pleased to adjust. Kimmel and Short protested this hearing. They pointed out that unsworn testimony had been taken at one point, that some significant testimony had been left out. They were denied the right to have fellow officers serve as their counsel or to ask witnesses questions. And so they did something that was very unusual for a military officer. They actually requested that they'd be court-martialed. Now, members of Congress were demanding court-martial. They said, yes, let us be court-martialed because we want the matter of Pearl Harbor to be decided in a real courtroom using standardized rules of evidence. But President Roosevelt said no. He said, look, these men have been dismissed of their duties, been punished enough. We're at war now. What possible good can come of court-martials? But Congress kept pressing its case for court-martials, as did the officers. And finally, in 1944, Congress mandated that the court-martials take place. They said, hey, look, we're winning the war now. What's the problem letting these two guys have their day in court? So the Naval Court of Inquiry and the Army Pearl Harbor Board convened. And at these two hearings, the attorneys for Kimmel and Short presented undeniable evidence that Washington had complete foreknowledge of the attack on Pearl Harbor, but withheld that information from the Hawaiian commanders. Now, as the admirals on the Naval Court of Inquiry heard the evidence being read, they threw their pencils on the floor in disgust. Admiral Kimmel was completely exonerated of all charges, and they laid the blame entirely on Washington, even though they couldn't name President Roosevelt by name because it was outside their jurisdiction. Everyone knew who they were talking about. The Army Pearl Harbor Board reached the same conclusion, that Pearl Harbor had been completely known about by Washington. In fact, these are the closing words of their official report. Up to the morning of December the 7th, 1941, everything that the Japanese were planning to do was known to the United States. Now, the public reacted with death threats and hate mail when Kimmel and Short were blamed. But how did they react to their exoneration here? And the answer is they didn't react because President Roosevelt ordered that the court-martial findings be hushed up and quashed and be held top secret, citing the war effort as his justification. But after World War II, a number of forthright authors tried to warn the public about the truth. Several books appeared. This book was published in 1954, The Final Secret of Pearl Harbor, subtitled The Washington Contribution, by Rear Admiral Robert Theobald, who was in Pearl Harbor on the day of the attack, commanding destroyers. But these books were ignored by the establishment press, so most people never found out they existed. Biggest breakthrough came in 1982 when John Toland, the dean of World War II historians, published this book, Infamy, Pearl Harbor and its Aftermath. Now at this point, many witnesses had come forward who had not had the courage to do so at the time of the court-martials, and also certain information had been declassified. Following the publication of Toland's book, The New American asked me to write a cover story on Pearl Harbor summarizing the findings of him and other authors. And then the BBC in 1989 produced this documentary, Sacrifice on Pearl Harbor, which really repeated everything we said in The New American, and that's aired on the History Channel. Now at this point, some of you might wonder, well, what's all this stuff about foreknowledge of the attack, Jim? You're getting ahead here, you haven't proven a thing. Isn't that just a sensationalistic charge? Well, how did Washington know about the attack? They knew through several means. One was the Purple Code, which was the diplomatic code that Japan used to communicate to its embassies and consulates throughout the world. Now, the Japanese figured this code couldn't be broken. It was so complex it had to be deciphered and enciphered by machine. Well, in 1940, a talented group of American cryptoanalysts broke that code. So in 1941, when our relations with Japan were very tense, we were reading Japan's diplomatic messages on a same-day basis. And every day, those messages went in pouches to President Roosevelt, as well as the Army Chief of Staff, George Marshall, Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, and the Secretary of War, Henry Stimson. Now, what did these messages reveal? They revealed that the Japanese had ordered their spies in Honolulu to start telling Tokyo the exact locations of our ships in dock. Hey, there's nothing unusual about spies watching ship movements, but when a spy wants to find out the exact location of each ship in dock, the implication is obvious. These messages also revealed that the Japanese embassy in Germany had told the Germans war was about to break out, that the Japanese had told all their consulates and embassies in America to start burning their secret codes and messages. Why? Because when war broke out, they'd lose their immunity. If you saw the Hollywood movie Tora, 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 there's a scene in there where the American Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, there's the real Cordell Hull, is given the Japanese declaration of war by the Japanese ambassadors after the attack, and he reacts in the movie with surprise and shock. But in real life, Cordell Hull was not surprised with the declaration of war. He already read the intercept of it the day before, December the 6th, that is, in his office, as had President Roosevelt, the first 13 parts of that 14-part declaration. Now, but it wasn't just through the diplomatic intercepts we knew about Pearl Harbor. We also knew through personal warnings. Joseph Grew, our ambassador to Japan, had personally warned the president in 1941 that if relations with Japan grew worse, the Japanese planned to attack Pearl Harbor with all their might, and this was coming from information from the Peruvian embassy in Tokyo. J. Edgar Hoover, director of the FBI, according to eyewitness testimony, personally warned the president about Pearl Harbor. He based this on information he got from a Yugoslavian double agent named Dusko Popov, who was working for both the Nazis and us, but his true allegiance was to us. Now, the Japanese had gone to the Germans for advice on how to attack Pearl Harbor. Popov learned that and told Hoover, who went on to tell the president. And you can see Dusko Popov interviewed in that BBC documentary, Sacrifice at Pearl Harbor. Brigadier General Elliot Thorpe was the U.S. military observer in Java, which was then under the control of the Dutch. And the Dutch had also cracked Japan's codes, learned of the Pearl Harbor attack, and warned General Thorpe. He sent a total of 4 warnings to the War Department, till finally General Marshall replied, "Send us no more warnings concerning Pearl Harbor." And you can also see General Thorpe interviewed in that same documentary from the BBC. Colonel F.J.L. Weijeman was the Dutch military attaché in Washington at the time, and he has testified he personally warned General Marshall of the attack. And Senator Guy Gillette and Congressman Martin Dies both received warnings concerning Pearl Harbor. Both shared the information with the president, and both men said the president said to share it with no one else, but to leave it in his hands, the president's hands. Now, in 2001, Disney produced this movie, Pearl Harbor, starring Ben Affleck. A stand-in rendering which showed the president completely surprised and caught off guard. Jerry Bruckheimer, the movie's producer, used 4-letter words to describe anyone who would suggest otherwise. So in response to that, the New American asked me to write a new article on Pearl Harbor, because at this point we had new information. Thanks to Robert Stinnett in his book, Day of Deceit, The Truth About FDR and Pearl Harbor, Stinnett broke new ground. Using the Freedom of Information Act, he proved that we not only knew the Japanese diplomatic code, we had also cracked their naval code. This had never been discovered by any previous hearing. Now, it was always presumed as the Japanese approached Pearl Harbor, they maintained total radio silence. Not true. They maintained discretion, but not silence. A number of times, and we were translating those messages, and the most significant was certainly this one. Admiral Yamamoto, the Japanese First Air Fleet, November the 26th, 1941. The task force, keeping its movement strictly secret and maintaining close guard against submarines and aircraft, shall advance into Hawaiian waters, and upon the very opening of hostilities shall attack the main force of the United States fleet and deal it a mortal blow. The first air raid is planned for the dawn of X day, exact date to be given by later order. No one can read that intercept and not know what it meant. Now, I'd like to mention that after our New American articles, I was honored to receive a note of thanks from Colonel Walter C. Short, U.S. Army retired, the son of the late Pearl Harbor commander. And we were also contacted by the attorney for the Kimmel family, who requested our permission to use one of our New American articles in their family's effort to exonerate the late Admiral Kimmel. And I'd also like to mention that Congress has exonerated both Kimmel and Short by an official resolution of any wrongdoing in the matter of Pearl Harbor. However, and not due to any special effort on my part, but I do want to mention, though, how many people know this even had controversy about Pearl Harbor? Most people don't know it because the mass media won't discuss it. And as we'll see tonight, there are many things the mass media does not discuss. Let's kick it back to World War I. What was the emotional event that kind of brought us into World War I? There were several, but what was the most emotional event?
Lusitania.
Sinking of the Lusitania. 1915, Germany and Britain were at war. We had not yet joined World War I. The Lusitania was a British passenger ship on her way from New York to England, sunk by a U-boat, and more than 100 Americans lost their lives. Now, Americans were told the Germans did this simply as an act of cruelty. They wanted to kill a lot of innocent women and children. But that's not why the Germans sank Lusitania. They sank it because it was loaded from one end to the other with munitions. Millions of rounds of ammunition, shrapnel shells, gun cotton, and so forth. As an act of war, they were trying to prevent those munitions from being used against Germany. Now, everyone who survived that explosion, which, by the way, it only took 18 minutes for the Lusitania to sink, but everyone who survived the disaster said there were 2 explosions, a small one and then a large one. The small one was a torpedo connecting. The large one was the munitions detonating, and that was confirmed eventually by the logbook of the U-boat's captain. The U-20's captain wrote, "Single torpedo followed by massive explosion." But even more sinister was this. Prior to the Lusitania's being sunk, Sir Winston Churchill, who was then head of the Admiralty in Britain, had ordered a study to be done on what the political impact would be if a British ocean liner was sunk with Americans on board. And prior to the sinking of the Lusitania, an exchange took place between Sir Edward Grey, the British Foreign Minister, and Edward Mandell House, who was already mentioned earlier. He was President Woodrow Wilson's top advisor, even controller, we might say. Grey asked House this: "What will America do if the Germans sink an ocean liner with American passengers on board?" House's reply: "I believe that a flame of indignation would sweep the United States, and that by itself would be sufficient to carry us into the war." Captain Joseph Kenworthy, then in British Naval Intelligence, wrote this: "The Lusitania was deliberately sent at a considerably reduced speed into an area where a U-boat was known to be waiting and with her escort withdrawn." Now, how can he say that a U-boat was known to be waiting? Well, at that time, the British had cracked Germany's naval codes, and together with that and recent activity of the U-20, they knew its approximate whereabouts. Now, following the sinking of the Lusitania, an official hearing was held here in the United States, but at that hearing, the officials were only allowed to see a dummy manifest that omitted the ship's munitions. The original manifest that listed the munitions was ordered by President Woodrow Wilson to be hidden in the archives of the U.S. Treasury. Now, some folks might think, hey, another sensationalistic, irresponsible charge. Well, actually, everything I've just told you, just about everything that's already been aired in the History Channel. You saw the documentary In Search of the Lusitania. You can also read about it in a wonderful book called The Lusitania by British historian Colin Simpson, and more recently in Room 40 by Patrick Beasley. Now, Beasley's considered the world's leading authority on the history of British naval intelligence. He's a former officer in British naval intelligence, and here's what he writes: "I am reluctantly driven to the conclusion that there was a conspiracy to put the Lusitania at risk in the hopes that even an abortive attack on her would bring the United States into the war." Kicking it back into history one more time, what was the event that brought us into the Spanish-American War? Sinking of the Maine. Now, there's the Maine. It was a beautiful new battleship, and in 1898, it sailed into Havana Harbor, and a few days later, a huge explosion tore through it, and that's what was left. 266 crewmen. Most of the crewmen lost their lives. And shortly after that, there were headlines like this in America: Spanish treachery, outside attack, naval officers believe. McKinley suspicious of Spanish plot. It was said that the Spanish had sunk the Maine with a mine or maybe even a torpedo. And so we went to war with Spain, and the battle cry was, of course, remember the Maine. But after that, a number of historians ask, what did really sink the Maine? Well, it's interesting. In 2002, the Discovery Channel released this. It's available on DVD. It's a documentary on the Maine. What they did was they asked naval engineers and scientists to recreate the sinking of the Maine. Now, these guys didn't just use a computer model. They actually reconstructed part of the hull of the Maine. They used the exact same kind of steel, exact same kind of rivets. They consulted the blueprints for the Maine, and then went and they visited a sister ship that's still afloat today. And they took this reconstructed hull and applied explosive pressure under differing conditions and compared it to the photographed wreckage of the Maine. At one time it was raised and extensively photographed. And in doing that, they were able to prove conclusively that the Maine sank from an internal explosion, not an external device like a mine as was originally claimed. What does that mean? It meant we went to war under the wrong pretext. Now, we start with Pearl Harbor. Let's start moving forward towards the present. The next war after World War II, of course, was the Korean War, when the communist dictator of North Korea, Kim Il-sung, ordered his troops to invade South Korea. Here's a trivia question very few people can answer. How come Kim Il-sung and the communists were in power in the first place in North Korea in 1945? You know, it took Mao Zedong until 49 to take over China. How come the Reds were there in 45? Well, the answer is that in a roundabout way, we put them there. During World War II, Stalin was our ally. Not much of a choice for an ally, but he was fighting the Germans like we were. But he was not fighting the Japanese. He had a non-aggression pact with the Japanese. But at the Yalta Conference, President Roosevelt asked Stalin if he would break that pact with the Japanese. And he said, sure, I'll fight the Japanese on one condition. The condition is the United States has to provide all the planes, tanks, jeeps, weapons, and food that my Far Eastern Army will need to undertake this expedition. So Roosevelt agreed, and 100 U.S. ships that were supposed to bring supplies to our troops in the Pacific were diverted to Russia to equip Stalin's Far Eastern Army. Now, this has to be one of the greatest blunders, if you call it that, in American diplomatic history. When does Stalin go into Asia to fight the Japanese? After we've already dropped the atom bomb on Japan. War's about to be over. We don't need Stalin at all. So he goes into China, collects the surrendered Japanese supplies and munitions, which he hands over to Mao Zedong for the overthrow of the nationalist government. That plus the American Lend-Lease supplies he's just received. But what about Korea? Now, Korea up until now has been a protectorate, a colony, if you will, of Japan. What to do with it? Well, as we'll see tonight, America's most influential journal of foreign policy is called Foreign Affairs. And in 1944, Foreign Affairs published an article called Korea in the Post-War World. In this article, they suggested that Korea, after the war, should be divided into a trusteeship. Now, this is the same deal we gave to Germany. Remember what happened to Germany after World War II? We divided into East and West. Russians get the East, we get the West. Foreign Affairs, we should do the same thing with Korea. Divide it in half. Our noble allies, the Russians, will get the North, and we will take over the South. It was our proposal put to Stalin by Roosevelt, and again, at the Potsdam Conference, Harry Truman put that proposal to Stalin, and he agreed. Now, some people might explain it this way. I like to become my own critic sometimes, so I'm just going to come over here and I'll speak a little louder. Well, Mr. Perloff, you have to understand that the guys who make our foreign policy are just good Joes like you and me, but sometimes, like you and me, they make mistakes. Now, Mr. Perloff, are you perfect? You're not? What a surprise. You're the guys who make our foreign policy. Look, it's easy for you to mouth off and complain about this 60 years after the fact. Hindsight's 20/20. You weren't there at the time. These guys were operating on the best information they had. You know what, Mr. Perloff? It's very easy for you to carp and complain and whine about this, but the fact of the matter is there's a very easy explanation for this, which is that accidents do happen. Hey, well, you know what? Before we write this off as an accident, I want to point out that this little accident cost over 50,000 GIs their lives in the Korean War, 1.1 million Koreans their lives in that war, and created one of the deadliest regimes the world has ever known. So before we write this off as a little blunder, I want to quote someone who didn't think it was a blunder, and that was James Forrestal, Secretary of Defense under Truman. He had noted that there were certain diplomats who made decision after decision after decision that favored the Russians. Here's what he said about it. That's Forrestal. Consistency has never been a mark of stupidity. If the diplomats who have mishandled our relations with Russia were merely stupid, they would occasionally make a mistake in our favor. So much for the chance theory. By the way, any of you know how Forrestal died?
Pushed out a window.
Went out May the 22nd, 1949, fell out a window of the 16th floor of Bethesda Naval Hospital. However, some people have a way of explaining that. Hey, accidents do happen. Guy probably slipped on a banana peel. You know, that happens on the 16th floor of skyscrapers every day. You know, we could spend a lot of time just on James Forrestal's death. But instead, let's go to the next war, Vietnam. Now, what was the name of the resolution that authorized our president to intervene with force? Tonkin Gulf Resolution, there it is. And it's based on an alleged attack on U.S. destroyers on August the 2nd and 4th, 1964. However, there's significant evidence that the latter attack never took place at all that led to that resolution. Admiral James Stockdale, recipient of the Congressional Medal of Honor, was a Navy pilot stationed in the Tonkin Gulf at that time. He was ordered to the scene of the alleged attack, overflew it for 90 minutes, and then later on, you know, he was captured, he was shot down sometime later, spent 7 years in a communist POW camp, came home, wrote his memoirs, which I have right here. And I'd like to read from those memoirs about the Tonkin Gulf attack. I'm going to pick it up from his return to the aircraft carrier Ticonderoga. By the way, this talk I'm giving tonight, I know we're here kind of a long night. I'm going to break it up at one point with a break, okay? About 2/3 of the way through what I'm saying, to let you know, we will take a break. But here he is. He's back on the Ticonderoga after visiting the scene of the alleged attack. Quote, wheeling into the ready room, I had heard he left 3 hours before. I came face to face with about 10 assorted ship's company, air group, and staff intelligence officers, all with sheepish grins on their faces. The mood of the group was mirthful. Obviously, they had some big joke to tell me. What the hell's been going on out there, they laughingly asked. Damned if I know, I said. It's real flap. The guy in the Maddox, that's one of the destroyers, air control was giving blow-by-blow accounts, turning left, turning right, torpedoes to the right of us, torpedoes to the left, boom, boom, boom. I got right down there and shot at whatever they were shooting at. I came around toward the destroyers once, right on the deck, chasing some imaginary PT boat they said was running up behind them. Did you see any boats? Not a one. No boats, no boat wakes, no ricochets off boats, no boat gunfire, no torpedo wakes, nothing but Black Sea and American firepower. For goodness sakes, I must be going crazy. How could all that commotion have been built up out there without something being behind it? Now, the next morning, Stockdale is awoken by a young officer. "Who are you?" I asked. "I'm the junior officer of the deck, sir. The captain sent me down to wake you. We just got a message from Washington telling us to prepare to launch strikes against the beach, sir." "What's the idea of the strikes?" I asked. "Reprisal, sir." "Reprisal for what?" "For last night's attack on the destroyers, sir." I flipped on my bed lamp and the young officer left. I felt like I'd been doused with ice water. How do I get in touch with the president? He's going off half-cocked. The fact that a war was being conceived out here in the humid muck of the Tongan Gulf didn't bother me so much. But for the long pole, it seemed to me important that the grounds for entering war be legitimate. I felt it was a bad portent that we seemed to be under the control of a mindless Washington bureaucracy, vain enough to pick their own legitimacies, regardless of evidence, unquote. And as many of you know, it was eventually learned that the Tongan Gulf Resolution was written before the Tongan Gulf incident took place. Finally, the war in Iraq. You know what? I don't have any controversy tonight about the war in Iraq. I have several friends in Iraq now. I have friends whose sons are in Iraq. We're not going to argue about the merits of the war in Iraq, except one thing I want to mention about it is this. We're being told today we're in Iraq to bring freedom and democracy to the Iraqi people, Operation Iraqi Freedom. But that's not the reason we were given before we went to war. We were told it was all about weapons of mass destruction. I'm sure you recall that Colin Powell went before the UN and told the UN he had absolute proof of weapons of mass destruction, and he said, "My colleagues, every statement I make today is backed up by sources, solid sources. These are not assertions. What we are giving you are facts and conclusions based on solid intelligence." And this is what the president told the American people. Saddam Hussein and his weapons are a direct threat to this country, to our people, and to all free people. I will not leave the American people at the mercy of the Iraqi dictator and his weapons. As many know, David Kay, the chief weapons inspector for us, said that no weapons of mass destruction could be found, and it was his opinion, he said, that no such weapons had existed in Iraq since the first Gulf War of '91. And Colin Powell later acknowledged that the statements he made before the UN were based upon faulty intelligence. Now, if you look at these 6 wars, Spanish-American, World Wars I and II, Korea, Vietnam, and Iraq, you can make a pretty good case that in every case, we went to war under a false pretext, or to put it most charitably, a mistaken pretext. Now, is there another common denominator to these 6 wars? I'm going to say that there is, that this same group of men were behind our involvement in each of these wars. Now, for my critic, I would say at this point, hey, Mr. Perloff, newsflash, the guys behind the Spanish-American War would be kind of dead now, don't you think? So how could they be behind the Iraq War, buddy? Organization that exists throughout long periods of time. And there's many organizations like that, right? For example, the Communist Party was founded in 1848 by Marx and Engels, yet more than 100 years later, long after they're dead, the communists took power in China. There's millions of Republicans today, but the founders of the Republican Party go back to the days of Lincoln, are all dead now. They say the mafia goes back hundreds of years, the Christian church 2 millennia. I'm talking about an organization like that, right? That as old members die off, new ones are coming in. So what organization am I talking about? Now back in 1970 when I was a hippie, and of course that's not me, but I used to hang out with guys like that. The hippies used to say that they were anti-establishment. They say, hey man, it's really the establishment that runs this country. And what do they mean by that? They meant that there's a wealthy elite that runs America. You know what? I do agree with the hippies on that. Where I disagree with them is the way they characterize the establishment. You know what they thought back then? They thought the establishment was conservative, anti-communist, patriotic, and Christian. In other words, it was just like the John Birch Society, only richer. A pretty good definition of the establishment was written by Edith Kermit Roosevelt. She was not only the granddaughter of President Teddy Roosevelt, but she was a syndicate columnist. She said this: the word establishment is a general term for the power elite in international finance, business, and government, who wield most of the power regardless of who is in the White House. Most people are unaware of the existence of this legitimate mafia, yet the power of the establishment makes itself felt from the professor who seeks a foundation grant to the candidate for a cabinet post or State Department job. It affects the nation's policies in almost every area. Let me underscore two things she said. International finance, as we'll see tonight, these guys are heavily linked to Wall Street, and also, regardless of who's in the White House, a lot of us think it's a big deal whether there's a Democrat or Republican there. To these guys, it makes no difference. Now, some people would say this, Mr. Perloff, you obviously don't know a thing about American government, because if you did, you know we have government of the people, by the people, and for the people.
Which people?
Oh, good question, yeah. But that's not the question this guy's asking. He's saying it's these people, the voters. He says, hey, look, Mr. Perloff, the voters are the guys who have all the power in this country. We're the ones who put these guys in office, so obviously we get the government that we deserve. You know what, Mr. Perloff? If we don't like the government we've got, what we're going to do is vote the rascals out at the next election. Simple as that, okay? So, Mr. Perloff, you can rest assured there's no sinister power behind the throne here in America. We, the people, we're the only power behind the throne that there ever will be. You know what? I agree that in principle, power is supposed to belong to the people, but I don't agree that we hold it in fact. Now, the establishment knows we have elections in this country, and they've figured ways around that. Now, elections are not actually my main focus tonight, but for one thing, they've figured out how they can control the selection of the candidates of the two major parties in their favor. And I don't want to leave that unattended, even though we're not really talking much about elections tonight. I want to take an example. 1976, Jimmy Carter was elected president, but here's a trivia question. 7 months before the Democratic National, that's the nominating convention, what percentage of registered Democrats favored Jimmy Carter for president?
3%.
How many?
1%.
Well, pretty close. It was less than 4%. Most people hadn't even heard of Jimmy Carter. So what happened? Well, he got invited to the Tarrytown, New York estate of David Rockefeller on the left, the establishment's kingmaker, and in attendance at that meeting was Zbigniew Brzezinski, who later became National Security Advisor under Carter, and who Barack Obama now cites as his top mentor. But these two guys picked Carter, and let me just quote what the conservative Senator Barry Goldwater said about this. He said, David Rockefeller and Zbigniew Brzezinski found Jimmy Carter to be their ideal candidate. He helped him win the nomination and the presidency. To accomplish this purpose, they mobilized the power of the Wall Street bankers and the media controllers. Now, let me flesh that in. After that meeting with Rockefeller and Zbigniew Brzezinski, Carter's picture appeared on Time magazine's cover 3 times, and Time's cover artists were told to make him look as much like President John F. Kennedy as possible. He appeared on Newsweek's cover twice. The New York Times ran a series of articles puffing Jimmy Carter. The Wall Street Journal did an editorial saying the best Democratic candidate who would make the best president for America would be Jimmy Carter. That got the businessman vote. And every night, the 3 networks, ABC, CBS, NBC, inundated the public with images of Jimmy Carter. So guess what? When the nominating convention rolled around, guess who got the nomination? But did he get that nomination because all across America, the voters of America spontaneously decided that Jimmy Carter was their man, or was it because he was picked in a high place and then packaged and sold to the public? I respectfully suggest that it was the latter, and that has been the case for most of our major party presidential candidates for the last few decades. Very nice audience tonight. Very nice audience. But besides elections, the establishment figured out that they could directly influence the presidency, and the main organization they used to do that is the Council on Foreign Relations, CFR, the subject of my book, The Shadows of Power. And what is the goal of the Council on Foreign Relations? We're going to talk about how they influence the president, but what's the goal? I'm going to quote in answer to that question Admiral Chester Ward, former Judge Advocate of the U.S. Navy, was invited into the council and spent 16 years there, even though he was shocked by what he found and later exposed it. Here's what he said. He said, the main purpose of the Council on Foreign Relations is promoting the disarmament of U.S. sovereignty and national independence and subvergence into an all-powerful one-world government. Well said, Admiral Ward. Even our own Boston Herald once editorialized on this. They had a little editorial on the Council on Foreign Relations a few years ago, in which they called them foreign policy fuzzy thinkers who worship world government. Now, there's a lot more quotes like that in my book, the shadows of power. But what is a world government? What is that? Well, a world government would run the whole world. Now, that's not what we have today. We have the Japanese government running Japan, and Brazil's government runs Brazil. In a world government, you'd have a single government for the whole world. Now, some people would say, Mr. Perloff, never would happen in a million years. Well, it's happening right now in Europe. You know, countries like Spain and England, that were once mighty empires, are being reduced to province status in the European Union. Look, they're consolidating their currencies into the euro. They're consolidating their armies. They're going to have a European Pentagon. They're going to have a European Constitution. They have a European Court of Justice now that can extradite a citizen from any country within the Union, and his own country can't protect them. The European Union is a work in progress. It's not finished yet, but it's a small model of world government. Now, Foreign Affairs, the journal of the Council on Foreign Relations, I went through every issue before I wrote my book, The Shadows of Power, and I found countless statements advocating world government. In its first year of publication, 1922, we read this: obviously, there's going to be no peace or prosperity for mankind so long as it remains divided into 50 or 60 independent states. The real problem today is that of world government. I want to underscore one thing this author said. I constantly found that the advocates of world government promised peace and prosperity as the justification for world government. What they would say is, they would say that, look, there's nothing worse than war, right? And the only reason we have war is we have different countries divided into these different countries. Now, if we just got rid of the countries and we had one world government, we'd all live in a big brotherhood. We'd have peace, prosperity, and happiness. However, contradicting that is Rudolf Rommel, professor emeritus of political science at the University of Hawaii. He did a study of death in the 20th century, and he found that in that century, 4 times more people were killed by their own governments than were killed by war. So war turns out not to be as dangerous as government. If we had a world government, who's going to run it? Now, the globalists will say that hey, look, international coalitions are great. Look, an international coalition stops Saddam Hussein. But what happens if Saddam Hussein runs your world government? Where are you going to go to hide with a world government? Founding Fathers of America knew it's very dangerous to concentrate power in one place. So they gave us not just an executive branch, but a legislative one. And of course, within the legislature, we have a check on power between the House and the Senate. And then you have the judicial branch. And I know there's been corruption in all of these branches of government, but at least the balance of power has prevented an absolute dictatorship in this country. And of course, in the original conception of the Founding Fathers, the states were actually supposed to further counterbalance the power of the federal government, although that matter was settled negatively for the states in the war between the states. Our President James Madison said, the accumulation of all power in the same hands may be pronounced the very definition of tyranny. You can be sure if there's a world government, it will mean tyranny for the world. My talk naturally divides itself into 3 parts. That's the first part. We're going to do the second part, then we're going to take a break and do the final part. Well, how about this Council on Foreign Relations? How did it get started? It got started back in 1919 at the Paris Peace Conference, where Woodrow Wilson, who's on the right there, this conference was suddenly the aftermath of World War I, and Wilson brought the man on the left, his top advisor, Edward Mandell House, who was a front man for the banking community. His biographer called him the chief architect of the Federal Reserve System. Now, for a little while, I'll be talking to you guys about bankers and banking, and it may sound like I've switched gears on you. You may think, hey, Jim, you started talking off about foreign policy and wars, now you're talking about bankers. What's the relationship? Well, it turns out that the banking establishment is inextricably related to the foreign policy establishment in this country, and as we continue, that relationship will become clear. And by the way, it's not surprising that a plan for world control would relate to Wall Street and the banking establishment, because what do we say is most influential in the world? Humanly speaking, right, we say that money makes the world go around. And we want to know who's controlling something, we say follow the money, right? So let's follow the money and see who's behind the Council on Foreign Relations. Speaking of money, I'm sure you've noticed we've got inflation in this country. I was looking at price levels in 1962. In 1962, a postage stamp was 4 cents, a candy bar a nickel, a movie ticket 50 cents. You could go to college for between $1,000 and $2,000 a year. You know, the dollar has lost well over 95% of its value over the last 100 years. And we have all this inflation. Now, why do we have inflation? Now, the establishment likes to explain it in various ways. They'll say, You know, it's all the fault of the American worker. Some guy has a baby, so he goes to his boss and he says, "Hey, boss, I had a baby. Can I get a raise?" And his boss says, "Well, Joe, I'd like to give you a raise, but the only way I can afford to do that is by raising our prices. I'll have to pass on the cost, $20 a week, to the people we do business with." So the people they do business with say, "Hey, if you guys are raising your prices $20 a week, we'll have to do the same." So all across America, prices go up because Greedy Joe had a baby and asked for a raise. Greedy Joe and guys like him. And we're told that inflation is inevitable. It's like death and taxes. You'll always have it. In fact, you know what? For the last 50 years, every year, according to the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, we have had inflation. Never a year with deflation. But you know what? Inflation is not inevitable. I'm going to prove that right now. Check out this graph here, okay? This is inflation in America from 1665 to the present. I want you to notice the fact that for the first 200 years, 250 years in our country's history, we had virtually no inflation. The line is almost flat. Now, some people might object and say that, well, there was some inflation. What about those blips? Well, those blips are the Revolutionary War, War of 1812, and Civil War. When our country went to war, we'd sometimes print money to finance the war. You know what happens when you print money? You inflate the currency. But notice that after each war, money returned to its normal value. You know, in 1900, a dollar was worth the same as in 1770, the days of George Washington. No net inflation for over 200 years in this country. But then check World War I. We start to inflate as usual. Money goes back down a little bit, mostly due to the Great Depression, and it just skyrockets. See that big spike at the end? That's where we are now. By the way, that spike should be higher because the government's been understating inflation for the last few years. Sure. Each administration, we had an article about this in New American, each administration figures new ways to understate inflation, so they'll tell you it's 4% when it's actually about 10. But even given their figures, look at that spike. So there's no effect without a cause, right? So what caused that big spike? And the spike was the creation of something.
Yeah, look, it takes place in the 60s. It has something to do with the moon launch?
Yeah, exactly. It's almost as straight as the moon launch. But what happened was the creation of the Federal Reserve. Now, I know that Ben Bernanke is now the chairman, but I like to have Greenspan's puts on there because it's still more familiar to most people.
Sir Allen.
Sir, that's right. I forgot that it was knighted. Now, the Federal Reserve chairman has been called the economic czar of America because he and the Federal Reserve Board set interest rates. And by setting interest rates, they control the general flow of the stock market. You know, if interest rates are going sky high, CDs start to look good, people pull money out of the stock market because it's too risky. If they lower interest rates, money tends to flow into the stock market. And every mutual fund manager is always listening very carefully to what the Fed chairman says in hopes of getting a hint of direction of interest rates. Now, how did the Federal Reserve get started? Most people don't know the answer. People will say, well, it must have been an act of our government. True, it's the Federal Reserve Act. However, the man who introduced that, as Tom already mentioned tonight, was a senator from Rhode Island named Senator Nelson Aldrich. Most people have not heard of him, but most people have heard of Nelson Rockefeller, who was vice president under Gerald Ford, longtime governor of New York, a billionaire, one of the richest men in America. His full name was Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller, named for his grandfather, Nelson Aldrich. You see, the Rockefellers and the Aldriches intermarried. When Nelson Aldrich spoke on Capitol Hill, people knew he was speaking for the Rockefellers and their allies in the world of finance. Now, the fact is that the legislation he brought forward on Capitol Hill, he didn't write a word of it. It was written at a private group of bankers at J.P. Morgan's hunting club on Jekyll Island off the coast of Georgia. So some people would say, loony conspiracy theory. No, the first man to describe that meeting was actually B.C. Forbes, founder of Forbes magazine. One of the men who attended the meeting wrote about it in his memoirs. I know you guys all know Citibank. It used to be called the National Citibank. It was owned by the Rockefellers, and the president was Frank Vanderlip at the time of Jekyll Island. He was at the meeting, and here's what he said in his memoirs. That was an occasion near the close of 1910 when I was as secretive, indeed as furtive as any conspirator. I do not feel it's any exaggeration to speak of our secret expedition at Jekyll Island as the occasion of the actual conception of the Federal Reserve System. We're told to leave our last names behind us. We're told further that we should avoid dining together on the night of our departure. We're instructed to come one at a time and as unobtrusively as possible to the terminal of the New Jersey Littoral of the Hudson, where Senator Aldrich's private car would be in readiness attached to the rear end of the train for the South. Once aboard the private car, we began to observe the taboo that had been fixed on last names. Discovery we knew simply must not happen. If it would be discovered that our particular group had got together and written a banking bill, that bill would have no chance whatever of passage by Congress. Now, who's at the meeting? It's like a meeting of the mafia dons. The guys at this meeting represented 25% of all the wealth in the world at that time. It was a meeting of the three biggest banking houses in the world. Representing the house of Rockefeller were Senator Aldrich on the right, and on the left, Frank Vanderlip. Representing the house of Morgan, J.P. Morgan, were left to right, Benjamin Strong, head of J.P. Morgan's Bankers Trust Company. In the middle is Henry Davison, senior partner in J.P. Morgan and Company. On the right, Charles Norton, head of Morgan's First National Bank. But the man who most agreed was most important, and who led the meeting, was the man representing the European Rothschild interest, again who Tom touched on tonight, Paul Warburg. Now, a lot of people have not heard of Paul Warburg today, but if you've ever seen the Little Orphan Annie comic strip, or the movie Annie, you've seen a caricature of him. You might recall Annie had a rich benefactor named Daddy Warbucks, who was considered the richest man in the world. And so what the artist did, the original cartoonist, he simply took the name Warburg and changed it to Warbucks. I don't think that Daddy Warbucks is a very good fictional representation of Warburg. I think this fictitious banker is a better representation. But who is Paul Warburg? He's a German banker. His family had been allied with the Rothschilds in Europe for many years, and they'd grown rich by establishing central banks in Europe. And in 1902, the Rothschilds sent Warburg to America with a mission to establish a similar bank in America. As soon as he came here, he became a partner in Kuhn Loeb and Company, which was the Rothschild banking satellite in New York City. And he quickly formed an alliance with John D. Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan. Now, as Tom was pointing out, this alliance went way back. The Rothschilds had provided the original seed money for the Standard Oil fortune for John D. Rockefeller. They also bailed out J.P. Morgan when his company was in trouble in the 1800s. Now, J.P. Morgan, who owned a large number of newspapers, in 1907 started a panic by spreading a false rumor in his newspapers about the insolvency of a couple of rival banks, namely the Knickerbocker Bank of New York and the Trust Company of America. This led to runs on these banks. If you've seen the movie It's a Wonderful Life, they're an example of a run on a bank. You know, a bank would loan out money. If it loaned out too much depositor money, and all the depositors ran to the bank and demanded full withdrawal, the bank could be broken. And that's what happened to these banks, and it spread to others and became known in the history books as the Panic of 1907. Immediately after this, Rockefeller's newspapers, Morgan's newspapers, and Senator Aldrich began clamoring America must have a central bank to prevent any further such catastrophes. But why do they want a central bank? Well, who do you suppose Woodrow Wilson appoints vice chairman of the Fed, where he will set America's interest rates? Ba-bum, Paul Warburg. Who does he appoint to run the New York Fed, the system's nucleus? Ba-bum, Benjamin Strong. In other words, the very men who met at Jekyll Island and planned the Federal Reserve System were now put in charge of the system that they created. But why do they want the bank? Well, Paul Warburg was making a salary at Kuhn Loeb of $500,000 a year. Now that's way over $10 million in today's dollars. He gave that up for a position on the Federal Reserve Board, which only paid $12,000 a year. Why did he do that? Some people would say, well, Mr. Perloff, it's probably because when he came to America, he got imbued with the spirit of patriotism. I bet he wanted to just stabilize the American economy. To the contrary, I suggest that Paul Warburg said, why should I make a measly $500,000 a year at Kuhn Loeb? Well, I can make countless millions for myself and my friends in finance by running the Federal Reserve Board and setting interest rates in this country. I snap my fingers once, stock market's going up. Snap them twice, stock market, she's going down. Now, that brings us to reason number one for the creation of the Federal Reserve was control of the stock market. Now I'm going to become my critic for a moment here. Mr. Perloff, are you seriously trying to tell us the Federal Reserve is a conspiracy? Oh, come on, I've heard enough of this conspiracy talk. Listen, folks, this guy Perloff over here, he's trying to persuade you that he is a serious student of history. I'm going to prove to you otherwise. I've had a private investigator following Mr. Perloff around for the last few weeks, and I'm going to prove to you that he's nothing more than a conspiracy kook. I'm going to prove to you he has the 10 classic signs and symptoms of a conspiracy theory nut. Number one, his eyes are crossed. See that? They never focus. Number 2, he foams at the mouth. He's in there ranting and raving about his political ideas. Number 3, he's paranoid about this country's leaders. Can't you just see him saying they're out to get me? Yeah? There you go. I.e., the government is out to get me, okay? Number 4, like all these conspiracy nuts, he's a member of a militia group. Number 5, he has conspiracy on the brain. All he thinks all day, the conspiracy, conspiracy, conspiracy. You know what? If his Aunt Tilly fell down the stairs, he'd say that David Rockefeller pushed her down the stairs. Number 6, not very bright. If it doubled his IQ, it'd still be a 2-digit number. Number 7, I personally think this is very sad, but the poor dog really believes that Elvis Presley is still alive and on a UFO. In fact, if we listen, he's got a very crackly brain there, Mr. Perloff, but if you listen carefully, I think you can hear Elvis, Mr. Perloff's brain. Yeah. Now you're lonely tonight, loser, I'll tell you. All right, number 8, he's in the state of Idaho, like all these conspiracy nuts. He probably lives there in a shack with a one-eyed hound dog. He drives a pickup truck, has a sawed-off shotgun, all that stuff. Number 9, he's a member of the Bird Society, and like every true bircher, he observes ritual every night by looking under his bed to make sure there are no stinking, dirty commies hiding there. So he caught one, big deal. Hey, look, the guy's been looking under his bed every night for 30 years. He's bound to get lucky sooner or later. Number 10, the final proof he's a conspiracy kook. They're actually coming to take him away. Look at this. All right, rest my case. I'll put it back to Mr. Perloff now. I don't know why it is all my critics get all the laughs, you know. But anyway, if you think that only conspiracy nuts believe this, I'm going to quote another conspiracy nut named Charles Lindbergh. You all know Lucky Lindy, the first solo transatlantic flyer. But what many people don't know is that his father, Charles Lindbergh Sr., was an eminent congressman and helped lead the fight against the Federal Reserve. Yes, the fight against the Federal Reserve. So let's quote what he said straight for the congressional record. He said, "This act, the Federal Reserve Act, establishes the most gigantic trust on earth. When the president signs this act, the invisible government by the money power, proven to exist by the money trust investigation, will be legalized." Let's stop there. What does he mean by the money power? He's talking about the alliance between the houses of Morgan, Rothschild, and Rockefeller. The money power overawes the legislative and executive forces of the nation. I've seen these forces exerted during the different stages of this bill. From now on, depressions will be scientifically created. The new law will create inflation whenever the trust wants inflation. Our graph, no inflation before the Federal Reserve, nothing but inflation after the Federal Reserve. Congressman Lindbergh was right. Here's another prophetic statement he made. If the trust can get a period of inflation, they figure they can unload stocks onto people at high prices during the excitement and then bring on a panic and buy them back at low prices. The people may not know it immediately, but the day of reckoning is only a few years removed. Again, a prophecy. Was there a stock market excitement and a panic? Right. The crash of 1929. Now get this. In 1929, these men, Paul Warburg, John D. Rockefeller, the younger J.P. Morgan, who's taken over for his father, Bernard Baruch, who was a part of this establishment, and even Joe Kennedy, who operated on its fringes, were all out of the stock market. And if millions of small investors were wiped out, but not them. Now, if you read the biographies of these bankers, it says that they were out of the stock market because of their financial wisdom. I suggest otherwise. I suggest is because of their control. If you're running the Federal Reserve Board and you know it's going to hike interest rates in 1929, you know it to be out of the market, just to mention one factor. Now, Louis McFadden was chairman of the House Banking and Currency Committee for 11 years. He said this about that stock market crash. He said it was not accidental. It was a carefully contrived occurrence. The international bankers sought to bring about a condition of despair here so that they might emerge as rulers of us all. When the Federal Reserve Act was passed, the people of these United States did not perceive that a world banking system was being set up here, a superstate controlled by international bankers acting together for their own pleasure. Curtis Dahl was Franklin D. Roosevelt's son-in-law. He worked for the late Lehman Brothers. He was on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange on the day of the '29 crash, and he said of the crash, he said it was a calculated shearing of the public by the world money powers. But there was another reason for the creation of the Fed besides the stock market. Motive number 2 is creation of money from nothing. And at this point, I just want to mention that the best book you can buy about the Federal Reserve is called The Creature from Jekyll Island by G. Edward Griffin, and I hope we have a few copies on sale tonight. Creation of money from nothing. Now, you know we have a very expensive federal government. Did you know that our federal government, over the last 5 years, the average deficit has been over $300 billion a year? That means for the last 5 years, for every day, our government spends about $1 billion more than it takes in. Not only does the government take in money through income tax, right, and by selling bonds, but bonds are a lousy way to finance a government because you got to pay it back later with interest, right? But even with income tax and with bonds, our government still spends about $1 billion a day more than it takes in. So how does the government do that? You know, how does it keep paying the military and Social Security and defense contractors? How does it do that? How can it spend more than it takes in? And here's how it happens. Let's say that this week our government needs $1 billion to pay the salary of the federal employees. How are they going to get that $1 billion? What they do is they send an agent of the U.S. Treasury over to the Fed building on the right there, and at the Fed building, a representative of the Federal Reserve literally writes out a check for $1 billion to the Treasury. But here's what you need to know. This is not based on any assets the Fed is holding. It's money created out of nothing. It's fiat money. The Fed's technical term for it is monetizing the debt. Now, if you or I did that, we wrote out a check with no assets to back it up, we'd go to jail. But the Fed does it, and it's legal. Now, some people might say, well, that benefits our government. How does it benefit the bankers? Well, for one thing, the multinational global corporations that do business with our government can now get government largesse without having to raise any taxes. They just create money from nothing. But it benefited the bankers directly. Paul Warburg and his friends were no stooges. They knew this. What are the federal employees going to do with that $1 billion in salary that was just created from nothing? They're going to go deposit it at their bank, right? You just created $1 billion in bank deposits. How does a banker make money? By loaning out the money on deposit. You've just created $1 billion in bank deposits for the bankers to loan out. But actually, you created $10 billion because the Fed made it a rule that a bank has to have only $1 on deposit for every 10 that it loans out. So what did this mean, this creation of money from nothing? What did it mean for the bankers? Endless profits. What did it mean for us? Endless inflation. Because every time the Fed creates money from nothing, it causes inflation. Now, you might have heard of the great German inflation of the early 1920s. This is a woman in 1923 in Germany using money as fuel in her stove. The inflation in Germany, which they were using to try and repay their war debt, was so bad that people went down the street with the money in a wheelbarrow. And it cost 200 million marks to buy a loaf of bread. Well, let me tell you something. The Fed's doing the same thing. It's not as bad. But every time the Federal Reserve creates money from nothing, it inflates the currency and devalues your dollar's worth. They don't have to print the money these days. They just create it electronically. Same effect. Now, politicians love this scheme. You know why? I mean, they can go ahead and spend without raising taxes because every politician knows that raising taxes is the kiss of death at election time. But with inflation, finance spending, who do we blame? We don't blame the government or the Fed. We blame the grocery store or the retail. We say, you guys raised your prices again, right? But the problem isn't the prices are going up. The problem is the value of our money is going down. But the bankers still had a problem, you know. They're creating all this money from nothing. They wanted to loan it to somebody. Now, who do you suppose they wanted to loan it to? You think they wanted to loan it to me? Hey, I don't borrow that much. I might go belly up. Hey, I might not repay it. No, they wanted to loan it to just one man, Uncle Sam. That's right. The very guy they got it from is going to now loan it back to Uncle Sam through government bonds. Because Uncle Sam can always guarantee repayment. Which brings us to number 3, motive number 3, interest on loan to the American government. Now, can a granny from Des Moines buy a U.S. government bond? Sure. They wanted to be fair. They knew they'd have to be fair, but they knew that the bankers knew that they would buy most of these bonds. There's not a problem, though. How's the American government getting paid back the interest on the bonds that they buy with this money they've created out of nothing? And what the solution they came up with, the government didn't have many sources of revenue in 1913, mostly tariffs. They came up with income tax. You know, there was no income tax in America before 1913. In fact, did you know that in 1895, The Supreme Court declared that an income tax was unconstitutional. It's not in the Constitution. The only way they could create income tax was through an amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Now, get one guess, okay? Which legislator brought forth that amendment in the Senate? No, Senator Nelson Aldrich, the same man who brought forward the original central bank legislation. That is not a coincidence. But now, why did the American people accept an income tax? Here's why. Because it was only 1% of your income at that time. And naturally, Aldrich and others swore income tax will never go up. So Americans said, hey, I'm a patriotic Joe. If Uncle Sam needs 1% and I can always keep 99%, I don't mind losing 1% to my government. You know what happened? Congress raises a little smidge, and then another smidge, and another smidge, until finally we're all paying 18, 28, 33%, depending on your bracket, right? See, the bankers understood this principle. If you want to boil a frog, you can't just put him in boiling water. Put him in lukewarm water. Gradually increase the heat, and he'll never know he's been boiled. And that's what they did with the income tax by starting it out at 1%. But they always knew there was going to be more than that. Now, some people would object and say, hey, income tax soaks the rich. They never want that. Well, you know what? If you're making $100,000 or $200,000 a year, yeah, you get soaked, but not these guys. Now, in 1970, when I was 18, I worked for Kelly Labor in downtown Boston, making $1.80 an hour, the minimum wage. You know what? I paid more income tax that year than this guy, billionaire Nelson Rockefeller. He didn't pay 1 cent that year. And the reason we know that is because when he became vice president under Gerald Ford, he had to make public his income tax returns. Back in the 30s, J.P. Morgan was investigated by the Cora hearings, and they revealed that in 1931, 1932, he didn't pay 1 cent in income tax. Now, how do these guys brush aside income tax? Well, they put their money into tax-free foundations, and those foundations, which if we took the time tonight, are simply used to advance their own political agenda, influencing, for example, universities to teach nothing but politically correct thought. Now, take a look at these dates. 1913, they created the Federal Reserve, which enables them to create money from nothing, which they can loan back to the federal government at interest rates they themselves will set, as head of the Fed. Also in 1913, they've created the federal income tax, which will enable the American people to pay back the interest on all those loans. Only one thing is missing. America needs a reason to borrow. Now, if only something would happen that would cause America to borrow a lot of money. Oh, what happened in 1914? World War I begins 6 months after the creation of the Federal Reserve. Archduke Ferdinand is assassinated. We participate in the war. And as a result of the war, our national debt goes from a relatively manageable $1 billion to an unmanageable $25 billion, and it's been out of control ever since. Now, some people have another explanation for these dates, which is, hey, stuff just happens. It's all a big coincidence, you know. Now, some of you know that I give talks on creation versus evolution. I've written a couple of books on that. And in those talks, I talk about the evidence that we're here by design, that the world is too well designed to be the result of chance evolutionary processes. And sometimes people ask me, that's about biology. What's the connection between that talk and this one? Well, in those talks, I'm talking about the fact that God designed the world. There's evidence for that. What I'm talking about tonight is that evil also occurs by design. Now, do I believe in chance? Yeah, but not in politics. No. Some people would say this. They'd say, Mr. Perloff, you sound so unpatriotic. You sound like a darn communist. Look, Mr. Perloff, the Federal Reserve and income tax, whether it's American as mom, apple pie, baseball, and the American flag. Well, you think that they are underpinnings of our free enterprise system, and that it's communistic to talk about this. You need to read the Communist Manifesto, because in the Communist Manifesto, Karl Marx laid out 10 steps necessary to create a communist state. Step 2 was a heavy progressive or graduated income tax, and step 5 was centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and exclusive monopoly. When we introduced the income tax in the Federal Reserve, we instituted 2 of Marx's steps for a totalitarian communist state. They are not part of the American free enterprise system. There was nothing in the original Constitution about income tax, and Congress in the Constitution said Congress shall have the power to coin money and regulate the value thereof, not a private group of bankers. Now,
Why did they say coin, Jim?
Because coins are better. Now, it's easy to inflate money and print it, right? It's pretty hard to do that with coins. Smart pupil over there, or I should say teacher. Young people today are really struggling, as you know. And a young man might say, hey, you know what? My great-grandfather came to this country at the turn of the century. You know what? He owned his own home. He had 7 kids. His wife didn't work a job. How'd he do it? Me and Mindy, we got 1 kid, we're working 2 jobs. We can barely make the rent. What's wrong? Well, you know what? It's not what's wrong with the young people. When great-grandpa came here, for one thing, there was no tax, okay? Everything he earned, he kept. You know what? If you take what you earn today, the average American worker spends 50% of his income on taxes. When you add up your federal income tax, state income taxes, for you guys in New Hampshire, real estate tax, Social Security tax, sales tax, excise tax, you're paying 50% of your income in taxes. Does it make sense to now have to work 2 jobs to have the same standard of living? Plus, great-grandpa, when he came here, had a stable dollar, worth the same next year as it was last year. It wasn't going down 9 to 10% every year like it is today. You know what? The bankers are really sorry about this, and I've come up with a plan to help us all. They're very sorry. So sorry. So, that's why every day we send you 3 offers in the mail for a credit card. Because we know you can't take ends meet. We know you can't buy the groceries. But you just borrow a little bit, you know, from the bank, no problem. Of course, we will have to charge you 20% interest on that. Anyway, that concludes the second part of our talk. Now we take a little break. We're going to break off here, use the bathroom, stretch, and come back and complete the last half hour of this. Tie together the bankers and the politicians, and that's what we're going to do now. In 1910, when the Jekyll Island meeting took place, the U.S. president was William Howard Taft, and Taft opposed the Aldrich proposal for a central bank. And so for that, plus some other reasons, the bankers decided they were going to have to get rid of him. And the man that they chose to replace him was Woodrow Wilson. Now, Woodrow Wilson had a meeting with Bernard Baruch as part of this banking cartel, and Wilson pledged to do 4 things if elected. He said he would listen to advice on who should be in his cabinet, support an income tax, support a central bank, and listen to advice should war break out in Europe. But the establishment had a problem. How do you get this stiff-looking professor from Princeton elected over the very popular incumbent, William Howard Taft? And the way they did that was to split the Republican vote. They took the former Republican president, Teddy Roosevelt, and ran him on the one-time only Bull Moose ticket, and the J.P. Morgan people were the financial backbone behind that. So Republican voters split their votes between Taft and Roosevelt, and Woodrow Wilson got elected with only 42% of the popular vote in 1912. Now watch Wilson's career take off after he makes these pledges to Baruch. In 1910, he's a political unknown, president of Princeton University, but never held any elected office. In 1911, they made him governor of New Jersey. You have to give this guy a little political experience if we can run him for president. 1912, with the full power of the media behind him, which in those days meant the newspapers, Woodrow Wilson is elected President of the United States. 1913, his first year in office, sees passage of both the Federal Reserve and the income tax. 1914, World War I breaks out. 1915, the Lusitania sinks, and he hides that manifest, remember that? 1916, he's reelected on the campaign slogan, "He kept us out of war." But as soon as he's reelected, Wilson moves to get a declaration of war, which he achieves in 1917. 1918, the Germans surrender, since our entry into the war has changed the balance of power against them. And in 1919, Wilson travels to the Paris Peace Conference, which is settling the aftermath of the war. Now, who does Wilson appoint to head the U.S. delegation to the Paris Peace Conference? Ba-bam, Paul Warburg. Only he is qualified to run the Fed, and only he is qualified to head the American delegation. Who is Wilson's chief economic advisor at the conference? Bernard Baruch, the same man he made those promises to. And always present at his side is the banker's front man, Edward Mandell House. You know, when Wilson went to Paris, he didn't take a single legislator, not a single member of his party, not a congressman, not a senator went with him. Only the bankers and their entourage went to Paris with Woodrow Wilson. Now, his chief proposal was what? The League of Nations. Now, many people think that Woodrow Wilson invented the League of Nations. He did not. It was written by House and the banking cartel. There's House at the conference. And Ray Stannard Banker, who was the official biographer of Woodrow Wilson, said practically nothing, not a single idea in the covenant of the League was original with the president. Edward Mandell House's biographer, Charles Seymour, said this: Wilson approved the House draft almost in its entirety, and his own rewriting of it was practically confined to phraseology. It was not his plan. Now, what were the bankers after with the League of Nations? They were after a world government. And some people would say, well, Mr. Perloff, if you know about history, you would know that the League of Nations was a very weak form of world government. After all, you said the bankers wanted an all-powerful world government. The League of Nations was anything but. That's right, because the bankers understood this principle. If you want to boil a frog, you can't put them in boiling water. You start them off with the League of Nations, you're going to build up to an all-powerful world government. How did America react to the Versailles Treaty and the League of Nations? Tom Moore already mentioned this at the open. Of course, we rejected it. The Senate said, hey, we helped win the war, but we're not surrendering our sovereignty to an international body. So how did the bankers respond to the news that the Senate had rejected the treaty and kept America out of the League of Nations? They rejected, they were very livid about it, and they held a series of meetings hosted by Edward Mandell House, culminating with a dinner at the Majestic Hotel in Paris, where they resolved to form a new organization whose purpose would be to change the climate of opinion here in America so that Americans would accept entry into world government. And of course, the organization incorporated two years later in New York City was the Council on Foreign Relations. Now, if you look at the original CFR membership list, you'll know something strange about it. Almost every man on it was either a banker or a lawyer working for J.P. Morgan and Company. The founding president was John W. Davis, who was J.P. Morgan's personal attorney. Founding vice president was Paul Cravath, who was another attorney working for Morgan. And the founding chairman was Russell Leffingwell, senior partner in J.P. Morgan and Company. Well, they thought it looked a little funny, too, that a foreign policy association consists of nothing but bankers and lawyers working for J.P. Morgan. So they, for coloration, they added a number of college professors, but guess what? The college profs all came from universities that depended upon J.P. Morgan and Company for grants and endowments. Were all yes men who could be counted upon to sit in at meetings at the council and go back and tell their students if America were truly civilized, it would join the League of Nations. Now, eventually, the Rockefellers brought their people in, and David Rockefeller was chairman of the CFR for many years and is still the honorary chairman. How does the council influence American foreign policy? There's several ways. One is through its many books, which are just about guaranteed to get reviews in the New York Times book review section, plus its journal, Foreign Affairs, which Time Magazine actually calls the most influential journal in print. This is like the Bible of the State Department. It said if you want to know what American foreign policy will be tomorrow, just read Foreign Affairs today. But the most important way that the Council influences American foreign policy and our policies in general is supplying cabinet members for the president. Now, when I wrote The Shadows of Power, was back in 1988 when Reagan was president, at that time, 14 secretaries of state, 14 Treasury secretaries, and 11 defense secretaries had already been drawn to the Council's ranks. Virtually every Fed chairman and CIA directors come from the council. This is not a big organization, you know. Back in the days of JFK, only about 1,000 members. Bill Clinton picked 12 of his cabinet members from the CFR. Now, earlier this year, the Washington Post listed the top foreign policy and security advisors for Barack Obama and John McCain. For McCain, 18 out of 34 advisors belonged to the CFR, and for Obama, 10 of 23. Hillary actually had the highest percentage, 14 out of 21, 2/3. What foreign policy programs has the Council created? Let's look at three quick examples from after World War II. What was the organization that succeeded the League of Nations? United Nations. Now, here's how my high school teacher explained the UN. He said, well, here's how the UN happened, boys and girls. You see, after World War II, all the countries of the world were really sick and tired of war. So they all got together and formed an organization that would stop war. And that's not how it happened. It began with a group of Council on Foreign Relations members called the Informal Agenda Group, and they coined the phrase United Nations. They drew up the plans. They called in several attorneys who were from the CFR and said it was constitutional. And by the way, they chose this name because it was so bland and innocuous sounding. They didn't want any senators snooping on them and finding out what they were doing. Well, after they finished the plan, they brought it to President Roosevelt, who approved it the same day, and that very same day announced it to the public, and then made the UN the central priority of his post-war planning. And when the UN held its founding conference in San Francisco in 1945, 47 of the U.S. delegates, almost all of the American delegates, were members of the Council on Foreign Relations. It was their show all the way. How about the Marshall Plan, the big plan to help Europe after World War II? And what your history book says, it was dreamed up by General George Marshall, who announced it at a Harvard commencement speech. It's true he announced it there, but he had nothing to do with thinking it up. The Marshall Plan was conceived of by a group of Council on Foreign Relations members at a group with David Rockefeller as its secretary. And originally they're going to call it the Truman Plan and have Truman announce it, but they realized that since President Truman was a Democrat, it might not get Republican support. So to ensure bipartisan support, they selected General Marshall to announce it, and it worked. It got bipartisan support. What was the purpose of the Marshall Plan? We were told it was just to help the poor. Well, for one thing, the multinational corporations attached to the CFR were naturally the beneficiaries of the tax dollars that sent goods to Europe, but there was a more sinister purpose beneath it. The man I'm going to show you on the left was John J. McCloy of the Council on Foreign Relations. He was in charge of all Marshall Plan funds in Europe. The man on the right is Jean Monnet, the founder of the Common Market. Time magazine called him the father of Europe. Now, in 1947, Monnet sent his representatives to McCloy and said he needed money to start a European Union movement. And McCloy put unlimited Marshall Plan funds at his disposal. Those funds were used to found European universities that would advocate European Union, start a European Union youth movement, fund the campaigns of politicians who advocated a European Union. And in 1947, when the Council of Europe met, that was a forerunner of the Common Market, it was entirely funded by Marshall Plan funds. Our tax dollars paid for it, and we didn't know it. Now, this guy on the left, McCloy, a true insider's insider. When he returned to America, became chairman of the CFR, chairman of Chase Manhattan Bank, and was one of the first presidents of the World Bank. I know you've all heard of the World Bank and International Monetary Fund. What your history books say is they were founded at the Bretton Woods Conference. But the fact of the matter is, although they were officially founded there, before that, all the groundwork was done at the Council on Foreign Relations at their Economic and Finance Group. In other words, the CFR is like a factory of American foreign policy. But the public, in the meantime, doesn't even know it exists by and large. By the way, what's the purpose of the World Bank and IMF? We're told that they're charitable institutions that help countries with debt problems. That's not it. It's a loan guarantee scheme for the private banks. After World War II, the banks down in New York still wanted to make big loans to governments, but they said, hey, after the war, some of these countries are kind of on shaky ground. What if one of them were to miss an interest payment? Wouldn't that be tragic for us if we missed one interest payment? We got to find a sucker, somebody stupid enough to pick up the tab for our mistakes. Who is the sucker? Us, the American taxpayer. Here's how the scheme works. Citibank makes a loan to Poland. Poland's go along making payments. All of a sudden the Poles say, hey, we can't afford to make this month's payment. World Bank comes in with our tax dollars, gives it to Poland. Poland gives it to the Citibank. The Poles win, Citibank wins, and the American taxpayer loses. And in case you think I'm making this up, let me quote the former chairman of the House Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Jesse Helms. He said this: the New York banks have found important profit centers and lending to countries plunged into debt. This has been an essentially riskless game for the banks because the IMF and World Bank have stood ready to bail the banks out with our taxpayers' money. A.K. Chesterton, the noted British political observer, said this: the World Bank and International Monetary Fund were not incubated by hard-pressed governments, but by a supranational money power which could afford to look ahead to the shaping of a post-war world that would serve its interests. Now we're going to talk about what the establishment is doing today, but I want to mention just one more historical event, and that's the Vietnam War. So I don't think anything changed America's social landscape more than the Vietnam War. Now, the establishment explains it as a quagmire. I once did a word search on Google with quagmire in Vietnam, found more than 1 million sites that pair those two words. They say, hey, it was just a big quagmire. It was all the military's fault. They thought it would be a piece of cake to beat communism in Vietnam, but they underestimated the loyalty of the Vietnamese people to the communist leader, Ho Chi Minh. We sent 100,000 troops, and that didn't work. We sent 500,000 troops. That didn't work. But the darn right-wing extremist patriotic hawks were too proud to pull out of Vietnam, and so they insisted on carrying on, and finally we lost and left in ignoble defeat after 14 years. And there was nothing you could do about it. It was just a quagmire, a swamp, a big mess. That's not what happened in Vietnam. First, Give it a little context, huh? In World War II, we fought a two-front war, right, in the Pacific and Europe. And let's give credit. The Germans and the Japanese were tough. They had tough armies, navies, and air forces, yet we defeated those two empires in just 3.5 years with the help of our allies. But in Vietnam, we fought a tiny little country for 14 years and didn't win. Something's wrong with this picture. Now, in 1968, a group of retired U.S. military officers were interviewed, and independently, they each said the United States could win the war in a matter of, at the most, 6 months. How? Well, North Vietnam was getting 90% of its war supplies to the port of Haiphong. They said, let's blockade it if we're serious about winning this war. Now, the communists in the South were getting their supplies through the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And President Johnson was occasionally bombing that trail, but you know, bombing is usually not a very good method of stopping supplies. These officers said, all you got to do is put troops on the mountain passes that guard the Ho Chi Minh Trail. You'll stop those supplies from going down. But at the same time, the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, of the Council on Foreign Relations, was only allowing the Air Force to hit 6% of the strategic targets it wanted to attack. He left the Defense Department, by the way, to become president of the World Bank. These guys are all in the same club. But the worst thing was probably the rules of engagement. The rules of engagement in Vietnam took 26 pages of fine print in the Congressional Record when they finally declassified in 1985. According to those rules, you couldn't shoot at the enemy first, you had to let them shoot you at you first. You couldn't bomb an enemy fighter if it was on the ground. You had to wait till it was up in the air and showing hostile intent. You could not bomb a surface-to-air missile launcher. You had to wait, if it was under construction, you had to wait until it was fully operational. Now, if we had fought that way during World War II, and I got to stand up a little bit because even though I have low stamina, so I can't sit for too long either. Let's go back to the jaunty days of the RAF, World War II. Let's say that the Royal Air Force is flying over Germany, and one of the pilots says, "Oh, Wing Commander, there appear to be about 50 Messerschmitt fighters on the ground below. Shall we commence an attack, sir?" The Wing Commander says, "I don't know, chaps. Wouldn't be cricket, you know. We've got to give those Jerrys a fair warning first. Let them get up in the air first, I say. Let them take the first shot at us, I say. You know, Mr. Churchill's given the strictest orders. We're to fight this war in a most sportsmanlike manner. But let these German chaps know they're dealing with real gentlemen from Oxford and Cambridge." Now, look, if we had fought in Vietnam under the same, if we fought in World War II under the same rules as Vietnam, we definitely would have lost World War II. We did not lose in Vietnam because the Vietnamese people loved Ho Chi Minh or communism. We lost because of the rules of engagement. So the question is, who was responsible for this mess? Now, the establishment has always wanted to think it was the military. But here's a question. When did President Kennedy first decide to commit troops to Vietnam? It was October 1961 when he ordered 10,000 troops on the advice of Walt Rostow of the State Department. That's an older picture of him. Now, so you might think, well, this guy Rostow must have been quite a anti-communist to advise the president to send troops to Vietnam. To the contrary, Walt Rostow, two of his aunts, members of the U.S. Communist Party, his father, a Marxist revolutionary in Russia. His brother, Eugene Debs Rostow, was named for the socialist leader Eugene Debs. In the 1950s, he tried 3 times to get into the Eisenhower State Department. Each time was rejected as a security risk. And the only way that the Kennedy administration could get him into the State Department was by firing the head of security for the State Department, Otto Otepka. And an entire book is written just on that subject, The Ordeal of Otto Otepka, by the late William J. Gill. Now you might think, well, maybe he wasn't a big anti-communist, but he must have been a great patriot. To the contrary, the year before he gave Kennedy this advice, he wrote this: "It is a legitimate American national objective to see removed from all nations, including the United States, the right to use substantial military force to pursue their own interests. Since this right is the root of national sovereignty, it is therefore in an American interest to see an end to nationhood, as it has been historically defined." An end to nationhood. Classic Council on Foreign Relations lingo, and of course, he a member of that group. Now, we said before the Tonga Gulf Resolution was written before the Tonga Gulf incident took place. Who wrote that resolution? It was the Assistant Secretary of State for Far Eastern Affairs, William P. Bundy of the CFR. So you might think, well, Jim, this Bundy must have been a great anti-communist if he wrote the Tonkin Gulf Resolution prematurely. To the contrary, you know what he's doing back in the 50s? He headed the defense fund for the Soviet spy Alger Hiss. No self-respecting anti-communist would do such a thing. And you might think, well, maybe he wasn't a big anti-communist, but he was a patriotic boy. He went I bet he went skipping down the street singing about mom and apple pie and waving the American flag. Well, you know what he became when he left the State Department? McNamara became head of the World Bank. Bundy became the editor of Foreign Affairs, this country's #1 journal, calling for the end of American sovereignty. Patriot he was not. Now, finally on Vietnam, why did President Johnson suddenly start escalating the war? 1965, he started sending hundreds of thousands of troops. Why? He did it because he was told to do it by a group of secret advisors, a clique of 14 senior statesmen, 12 of whom were members of the CFR. They were known informally as the Wise Men. Now, some people might say, well, Jim, that's just another loony conspiracy theory. No, if you don't believe it, then you need to read the book, The Wise Men, by Isaacson and Thomas, who themselves are members of the Council on Foreign Relations. And this book isn't bashing these guys, it's glorifying them. Then the man who was most vocal in insisting that the war be escalated was the leader of the group, Dean Acheson. So you might think, oh, well, obviously this Dean Acheson, if he wanted to escalate the war in Vietnam, must have been a great anti-communist. To the contrary, back in the 1920s, when we hadn't even recognized the Bolshevik regime in Russia yet, who do you suppose Joseph Stalin picked to represent Soviet interests in America? He picked a young attorney named Dean Acheson. Now, Jim, I'm sure there's a very simple explanation for that. You know, I bet that old Stalin didn't know who to get for an attorney. He just flipped over the New York, Manhattan Yellow Pages, closed his eyes, put down his finger, and his name happened to come on Dean Acheson. No, listen, after World War II, the new communist regime in Poland was having trouble getting recognized. And so what law firm did they go to in America to help get recognition? The law firm that every communist knew he could trust, the law firm of Dean Acheson, whose law partner was Donald Hist, brother of the Soviet spy. And in the State Department, when he was Secretary of State, Acheson surrounded himself with 14 members of the Communist Party USA, Lachlan Curry, John Stuart Service, John Carter Vinson, and on the list goes. He was not an anti-communist. By the way, you know who his son-in-law was? Ba-ba! Same guy who wrote the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. That's right, William P. Bundy. See, it was a tiny clique of men who got us into that horrible war in Vietnam. And when you realize it was the same clique that got us into the war that wrote the rules of engagement that made it impossible to win, you realize that what happened in Vietnam was no accident. Well, let's bring it up to today, because I know it's getting late. What's the establishment's agenda today? They're still promising us peace and prosperity. Now, the peace, they say, will come through the war on terror, and the prosperity will come through trade agreements. Now, let's do the trade first. You've seen most of these acronyms: North American Free Trade Agreement, General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, World Trade Organization. Free Trade Area of the Americas is supposed to be an extension of NAFTA to the entire Western Hemisphere, as it will see the Security and Prosperity Partnership as a plan for a North American Union. I'm sure you've also noticed that American jobs are disappearing, right? Our steel industry wiped out, textile industry wiped out, electronics industry wiped out. Where are the jobs going? Duh, they're going overseas. Why is that? Okay, here's why. It's because of these trade agreements and what they did. And here's what used to happen. It used to be, women would go to Walmart and she'd see two items, one made in America, one made in China. The one made in America cost $5, the one made in China, which had a tariff on it, cost $4.50. And she'd say, well, one from China is a little bit cheaper, but the one from America is so much nicer, I'm going to buy that. Then we get to the World Trade Organization. Our tariffs are abolished. Same woman goes to Walmart, sees the same products. The one made in America still costs $5, but the one from China now costs 95 cents, reflecting the value of its slave labor that made it. She says, I can't resist a bargain. I got to buy the one from China. So the American manufacturer goes out of business, or he has to move his factory to China. And that's what has been happening through our entire industry ever since we joined these organizations. Now, in 1994, the year that the World Trade Organization and the GATT Treaty, which got us into it, was being debated, its advocates in the Senate promised us, I know this because I taped the debates, were saying we'll never increase our trade deficit because of these treaties. We're just going to export and import. But you know what? The very next year, 1995, our trade deficit went to an all-time record, $103 billion. And last year, $711 billion. The biggest item we export today is jobs. By the way, how many votes does do the American people have in the World Trade Organization? When we joined the WTO, you're right there, you already guessed it, when we joined the World Trade Organization, Europe got 30 votes, Africa 35, and we get 1 vote. Our voting power is the same as the island of the Maldives, population 200,000, which means these other countries can kick us around and make up the trade rules that we have to abide by. But who pays for the WTO? You guessed it, yeah. The American taxpayer pays the lion's share because the World Trade Organization said that it's only fair for the richest people to pay the most. Who created the World Trade Organization? There was average Joes like you and me. Hey, Ralph, I think we ought to have a trade union with Mexico and Canada. That's a swell idea, Bob. Let's write our senators and... No. Foreign policy is not made by the people of this country. This is imposed from the top down. I taped the original hearings, Commerce Committee hearings. And the CFR sent one of their big shots, the banker Felix Rohatyn, down to testify before that committee. And he said, gentlemen, if you don't pass this treaty, the markets are going to react adversely. And one of the senators there, James Exxon of Nebraska, said, well, now, Mr. Rohatyn, we hear these dire predictions every day from you economists. Nothing ever comes of them. Well, that very same day he made that prediction, Alan Greenspan raised short-term interest rates 0.75%, a totally unexpected move, caught the markets by surprise, and for 4 straight days, the stock market plunged until Bob Dole ran to the White House, stood next to Bill Clinton, and promised the GATT treaty will receive bipartisan support in the Congress, and immediately the stock market rebounded. You can be sure, when you see major shakeups in the stock market like this recent one, it's being done for a reason. There is an end in mind. Now, the man who chaired those Senate hearings on the GATT treaty was Senator Ernest Hollings of South Carolina. Here's what he said on the floor of the Senate. They, meaning multinational corporations and banks, have got the Council on Foreign Relations up there in New York. If you run for president, they'll invite you. You can get out. You can get their contributions, you can get the support. I've been there, I know what I'm talking about. But that's what our friend David Rockefeller and all that got that steam together. It's not about jobs, it's about money. Well, they're getting rich and we're losing jobs. They are debilitating and destroying us. Wish more senators had listened to what he said. By the way, it wasn't just about jobs. It wasn't just about money. It was about changing the world. What is the true purpose of these international trade accords? Henry Kissinger said this of NAFTA. It's a big shot from the CFR. That NAFTA will represent the most creative step towards a new world order taken by any group of countries since the end of the Cold War. And David Rockefeller on the same subject said, everything is in place after 500 years to build a true new world in the Western Hemisphere. Catch this quote. NAFTA will signal the formation, however tentatively, of a new political unit, North America. With economic integration will come political integration. By whatever name, this is an incipient form of international government. Following the lead of the Europeans, North Americans should begin considering formation of a continental parliament. Look what happened in Europe. They started with an economic alliance, right? They were told, hey, we just want to have free trade and prosperity. The common market became the European Parliament, which became the European Union. The same thing is being planned today. They want to consolidate everything into a North American Union. And what about the war on terror? The other half of the peace and prosperity promise. We're all against terrorism, but a lot of us are concerned about the powers being given to the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. Now, as Tom was touching on as he opened up here, was that the plan for Homeland Security began before 9/11, began with the U.S. Commission on National Security, a 12-member task force with 9 CFR members in its ranks. And they proposed what they called a National Homeland Security Agency, the exact phrase used by President Bush after 9/11. A lot of us have this concern. Who's going to be defined as a terrorist under Homeland Security? Now, one answer to that comes from Anna Quindlen, who wrote a column for Newsweek after 9/11 called The Terrorist Here at Home. Who is she talking about? The pro-life movement. She said this, there's no real ideological difference between these people and the people who flew planes into the World Trade Center. One of the leaders of Operation Rescue once sent his followers a letter that concluded, return to the training so that God may use you. Sound familiar? See the idea here? If we as conservatives are redefined as terrorists under Homeland Security, we could have our rights taken away, our websites shut down, our ability to congregate together taken away. There's real danger here. Now, is there a connection between the trade agreements and the war on terror? Yes. Both are being used to justify turning North America into a union, a North American union. Robert Pastor, big shot in the Council on Foreign Relations, wrote this, security fears serve as a catalyst for deeper integration. That would require new structures to assure mutual security. The Department of Homeland Security should expand its mission to include continental security, a shift best achieved by incorporating Mexican and Canadian perspectives and personnel into its design and operation. It's happening, folks. One of the names, Security and Prosperity Partnership of North America. And in 2005, President Bush signed an agreement with President Fox of Mexico and Prime Minister Martin of Canada, laying the groundwork for a North American Union. They just have common IDs, common currency. They're going to call it not the euro, they call it the amigo here. The only person in the establishment media to even mention this agreement was Lou Dobbs of CNN, who said President Bush signed a formal agreement that will end the United States as we know it, and he took the step without approval from either the U.S. Congress or the people of the United States. By the way, are these regional blocs like North American Union or European Union ends in themselves? No, they're stepping stones to a world government, to world tyranny. Stalin, the Soviet dictator, understood this. He said this: populations will more readily abandon their national loyalties to a vague regional loyalty than they will for a world authority. Later, the regionals can be brought all the way into a single world dictatorship. That's the plan. Zbigniew Brzezinski said virtually the same thing. We cannot leap into world government in one quick step. The precondition for genuine globalization is progressive regionalization. There you have it. Well, there's just one last thing I want to mention tonight. I'll become my critic one more time here. Mr. Perloff, everything you said tonight is obviously hogwash. There's a litmus test we can apply to prove that this is just junk. Look, the Founding Fathers gave us freedom of the press, right? We have a free press in this country. It's right there in the Constitution. And take a look at all the various news media that we have in this country. Now, even though it's hard for you to read the top there, Mr. Perloff, I know. But look, here in Boston, read the Globe or the Herald. If you don't like that, read the New York Times or the Washington Post. If you don't like your news in that format, take it in a weekly format for one of those fine magazines. And if you don't like to read, Mr. Perloff, and I suspect that you don't, you can watch television news, okay? You know what, Mr. Perloff? Why should we believe a goofball like you? Well, we can turn to a tried and true source of news information like the New York Times. You know what, Mr. Perloff? You know, I'll believe what you said. I'll believe it when it's in the New York Times. Until then, don't hold your breath, okay? All right, now, what's the answer to this? Well, let me just point this out, that the establishment, which was so powerful enough to control the Federal Reserve and our government, you can be sure they also knew they had to control the media, which is responsible for what people think. Now, in my book, The Shadow of the Power, I have a chapter on the media. We'll just take one example, one quick example. Let's take the New York Times. The man on the left is August Belmont. That was not his real name, but when the Rothschilds sent him here from Europe, they gave him that name. They thought it would sound pretty classy to people. He was representing the Rothschilds, and he and J.P. Morgan gave a large sum of money to the man on the right, Alfred Ox, if he would buy a newspaper and turn it into an organ representing the financial establishment. Ox took that money and bought a tiny newspaper called the New York Times, which at that time had a circulation of only 9,000. But the power of money, okay? He moved it to Times Square, plush new headquarters, bought up channels of distribution, bought the most powerful editors and writers. But let me just point this out. The New York Times was not built on journalistic integrity. It was built on money. From Ox, the ownership passed on to Sulzberger, Dreyfus, and Sulzberger, all members of the Council on Foreign Relations. And if you look at the history of the New York Times, it consistently supported the establishment's viewpoint. For example, when Paul Warburg was up for nomination as vice chairman of the Federal Reserve, the New York Times editorialized on his behalf. What a great patriot he was. See that guy sitting next to Fidel Castro? That's New York Times reporter Herbert L. Matthews. With his articles in the New York Times that persuaded Americans that Castro was the George Washington of Cuba and not a communist. Well, Herbert L. Matthews was a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. The man on the lower left is Leslie Gelb, former New York Times editor. He's one of the men behind the Pentagon Papers, which so demoralized America during the Vietnam War. So I think, well, maybe this guy Gelb will expose the CFR. Not a chance. He was its president for 10 years. When you talk about the CFR in the New York Times, you're basically talking about the same organization. Now, what looks at first like a very diverse media is not so diverse. The New York Times owns the Boston Globe, just as the Washington Post owns Newsweek, just as Disney owns ABC News, just as CBS owns the big publishing house Simon & Schuster. Some people will think, hey, you know, I get up in the morning, I see the headlines on America Online, then I go turn on my TV and I watch CNN, and I hear the same story, then Time Magazine comes, I got the same story, hey, it's got to be true, how can they all be wrong, you know? I'm getting confirmation here. Well, the problem is that America Online, Time Magazine, and CNN are all owned by one corporation, AOL Time Warner, which also owns Turner Broadcasting and Warner Brothers, and 160 magazines aren't even listed there. You know, if you take all the major movie studios, major newspapers, radio networks, TV networks, and major magazines, you'll find that they're virtually all owned by about a dozen corporations which interlock at the top. For final confirmation, let me turn to the CFR chairman himself, David Rockefeller, said this in a speech in 1991. We are grateful to the Washington Post, the New York Times, Time Magazine, and other great publications whose directors have attended our meetings and respected their promises of discretion for almost 40 years. It would have been impossible for us to develop our plan for the world if we'd been subject to the bright lights of publicity during these years. But the world is now more sophisticated and prepared to march towards a world government, which will never go on no war, but only, what's that?
Peace and prosperity.
And prosperity. All right. Well, listen, that concludes my talk. I do want to mention that Hal Shurtleff's going to wrap up talking about what we can do about all this. I do want to recommend both the John Birch Society, commending them and thanking them for giving me the opportunity to speak. And I want to thank Tom Moore, who at the spur of the moment found this place tonight. Spur of the moment. Unbelievable. Talk about a can-do guy. My book, The Shadows of Power, does even though it was written some time ago, will reinforce much of the material for you. And I do want to mention the other items I have, which are separately for sale. My wife is back there. Tornado in the Junkyard and The Case Against Darwin are books about the evidence that we are here by design and by a creator and not by chance evolutionary processes. And I also give PowerPoint talks on this at churches. And there's also a music album there. This is an album of what you might call politically incorrect music. There's a tribute to Vietnam vets on it, a tribute to homeschoolers, a song about religious freedom. I wrote those songs. I don't sing them. We made this at a Christian music studio with 7 different lead vocalists. And don't buy it if you don't listen to it first, because musical tastes really vary. But there's a little CD player for those who might be interested in hearing that. So that concludes my talk. Sorry we had to run so late, but thank you again.
Very quick here. My name is Harold Shurtleff. I serve as the Regional Field Director for the John Birch Society. I would have been here earlier, but I was giving directions to some people. So, and again, the Endicott Estate served us well for many years. It was just I booked the main ballroom and someone else booked it and wires were crossed. So there was no conspiracy to get us out of there, believe me. And again, we could use the upstairs room, only that we needed to screen, and by the time we had this place, thanks to Tom, so we were all set. Anyway, I would want to recommend that you all buy a copy of Shadows of Power for several reasons. First reason is 1988 the book was published, and the John Birch Society was the publisher, and lots of books were distributed, including a copy to every single state rep and senator in the United States of America. Within a few years, we made contacts with many of these state reps and made friends with them, which made it possible for us to stop in 1995 a plan to scrap our Constitution, Conference of the States. So I can tell people that laid the groundwork to help defeat something that would have destroyed our Constitution. And it is the best book on the subject. When people, I still hear people arguing about Democrats and Republicans. The Republicans are better, the Democrats are better. If they read this book, I think this would stop pretty quickly and realize that, of course, that the two major parties are just part and parcel of the same, at least at the top. And also, it's a way he makes a living, selling his books. And the book on creation, Tornado Junkyard, is a great book. If you're a skeptic on the subject, I hope you read this book and you won't be. So please make the music video, which I do appreciate. So please help out with that. You also need to be, if you're not a member of the John Birch Society, you need to join the John Birch Society and help form local chapters, help sponsor events like this. There's just not enough of us out there doing this kind of work, and we need your help and we need your active participation. When you do join, you'll get a magazine subscription, a subscription of the New American Magazine. And by the way, the issue I'm holding up today, our goal a year and a half ago was to distribute 1 million copies in the hands of opinion molders to warn them about the North American Union, and we did accomplish that objective thanks to many of you people in this room, including getting in the hands of every single state rep and state senator in the country. I even gave one to Newt Gingrich down in New Orleans at a state conference. He gave it back to me, but I didn't give it to him, so it was in his hands. So again, I want to thank you. Also, if you are not on our email or mailing list, and you would like to be, we do not overwhelm you with things, but we do notify you of events. So I'm going to pass. I don't have a clipboard. I have to apologize. I'm in the process of moving, and I'm all over the place. And by the way, the book Creature from Jekyll Island that Jim promoted, I think we only have a few copies, but I have a case of them somewhere in a barn in West Roxbury. And if you want to, give your name and address, and how much they go for, Norman, 25?
Yeah, I'll take,
Yeah.
anyone that wants to get one from you, I'll
Yeah.
make arrangements for it.
Okay, and I'll get them
we'll
up.
leave the email list on the table.
I'll leave it on the table.
And we'll, yeah.
And for the sake of time, and also for Jim's health, we won't have a formal Q&A session, but I'm sure he'll be around for a few minutes.
I'll answer questions in the back.
Okay, he'll be talking in the back. So, thank you all, God bless you, and good night. And God bless America.
Al, give me the sign-up sheet, I'll work it. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.